We could burn like a flame through the atmosphere. Yeah.
All right, guys, let's get this show on the road. Turn down the volume so you can actually hear me above the music. Mr. Marcus, how are you today?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Good. How was your weekend?
Eventful. Just a lot of moving around. Took a trip to get my daughter back to school, so just fall transitions. I guess it's good she can get back there.
Yeah,
How about you?
exact. Same. Not moving for per se. I actually was at the Dells with the family, so we decided to do our annual water park event where we went to Noah's Ark and had a lot of
That's
fun
always
out
fun.
there. So I'm catching up right now. Basically, is where we're at, right? Where you've got a couple days out of the office, and it's like, wow, there's a lot of stuff that piles up, right? So
Yeah.
it's been kind.
No sunburn.
Yeah, no sunburn. No,
All right.
we had a cabana. So, we always get a cabana. So I hide in the cabana and have a couple beers and then go out and have fun with the kids on the ride. So it was a lot of fun though.
Yeah.
So
The Dells is always a good thing.
it is. Well, welcome everyone in chat too to another Stone Ridge Confab. We have our hosts, Scott Frappier and Marcus Haug, that are going to be going through and doing some presentations today on some of the Dynamics 365 licensing. It's one of our favorite topics to tackle on the pre-sale side. There's a little bit of sarcasm in there, right, Marcus? Because
That's
we've
right.
gone through a couple of changes, right, with it?
I'd almost rather take live Q&A than I would than I would
Yeah.
dealing with licensing questions.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. I actually this has taken me 2 weeks to just get to this point, right? So I always get teased because I've got the inability to grow facial hair. So, but we're gonna try it on stream today to see how it is. Beyond that, yeah, like you said, Marcus, it's always evolving, right? Especially when it comes to the way the app services are occurring, the way the model is working within Microsoft. It's a
Yeah.
pretty big adjustment for customers, right? That haven't had to classically deal with this.
Yeah, and I think unfortunately it's always evolving, and I'll just use the word evolve because I think Microsoft is actually trying to adjust licensing in places where maybe customers are having some difficulty or having some problems. I think what you see is there's some I think changes to the customer's advantage that come with licensing, but it does change. As I say, it's sitting in sand; it's not sitting in stone at all. So what may be true today may or may not be true this afternoon or tomorrow, even
Yeah,
in some
right. Yeah,
cases.
yeah, yeah. So, yeah, and that's a really good point because it
Yeah.
has evolved quite a bit as they've
Yep.
evolved the Power Platform, for example. We used to have BI licensing and some of the solutions that's changed now. So, at least, I guess what we want to do here today, right, Marcus, is really kind of just level set for people.
Yep.
In chat, if you have questions, I would absolutely put them in chat, and then we can hopefully incorporate that into the conversation. But really, what we're trying to do here is just get you a baseline in terms of understanding what do you need to consider when looking at Dynamics 365 and licensing. Because quite candidly, I mean, there's D365 sales, there's capacity add-ons, there's volume limitations that you can have for web API calls, and all these different types of events that can occur. And a lot of customers, when they get engaged with this, they don't they don't know, like, for example, that you can't have your 5 terabyte database. Well, you can, but you probably don't want your
Yes.
5 terabyte database in the cloud because you're going to spend an arm and a leg to maintain that, right? So
That's
you
right.
know we want to at least kind of demystify that today here, right, Marcus, to get into
Yeah.
some more details with it.
Yeah. And I think the key is that I hope we can present maybe large rocks or at least some things to sort of guide the conversation. I don't think we're going to be able to answer every question here today. And I think if you're a client that is transitioning, let's say from on-prem to cloud, if you're transitioning from an older version of the product you're using to the cloud, if you're transitioning, let's say from Dynamics product A to Dynamics product B, those are really conversations that have to be discussed one-on-one.
Yep.
because there are so many variables in there that a presentation that we do, we can't deal with all those different nuances.
Yeah, and one thing, I guess, a couple things that we can equip though, you as an end user or you as, wherever you're coming from in this conversation, really is to understand, how do we start going through the process of identifying,
Yep.
licensing in terms of like user roles, right? So one of the things that we typically go through, for example, on the enterprise side that we're going to talk about today, is we're trying to identify end users and their roles so that we can then align that to a license, because different roles can have different types of licensing attached to them to be able to drive business process functionality, right? And that's much more common now on how we tackle those requirements, right? In terms of making sure on the enterprise side that you can get away with, for example, an activity license versus a team license or versus a full license, right? Those matter because over time, those costs really add up, right? They can get
Yep.
pretty expensive, but at the same point, you got a lot of ability to use different licensing levels to minimize that cost. And that's really something that we try to explore as we go through this process, right? Because we don't want,
That's right.
if you got a read-only user, you probably don't want to spend for a full user license, right? When it's almost, I don't know, 1/20th of the cost basically for a team member license, for example.
Yep, that's absolutely right. Yeah, right sizing the licenses that you have to the users that need the access that they need.
Yep, exactly. I guess with that, Marcus, I know that you've got some stuff to show. Let's go ahead and, kind of flip
Yeah,
over here,
yeah,
because I guess what we want to start with, in my mind, is if we look at Dynamics 365 and we look at really the first licensing level in terms of complexity, right? When we're dealing with Business Central, we're dealing much more with what we call the SMB space, right? With the small, medium business, which also means in terms of complexity, we're not dealing with a lot of complexity in that conversation, right? There obviously is some, and I don't want to say that it's easy, but at the same point, compared to the enterprise side, I mean, we
or even
really,
the customer
if
engagement.
yeah, exactly, right? We're
Yeah,
really at BC, and the attached licensing isn't as complex. The Power Automate and those types of licensing isn't as complex. Why don't you kind of frame that? Because we're going to go into the enterprise portion of this next, but from an SMB perspective, what do we start looking for as we go through this process?
yeah. So when we start talking about licensing for Business Central, we really start with this question around essential versus premium licensing. So essentials, if you look at that as the base pack, if you will, I'm not sure exactly the terms here, but essentials is your core functionality. So that would be your minimal license. Premium then adds manufacturing and service. But even with the essentials license, there's a tremendous amount of functionality that comes with the product. So we've got full multi-company processing, full dimension processing. All your Cortana intelligence comes with that. You've got general ledger, banking, payables, receivables, sales order, purchasing, inventory. What I love about the way that the essentials license works is you get the inventory assembly functionality. So I'd say light manufacturing, right? You still could do a multi-level bill of material. You just don't have a routing. You get jobs. So we talk about projects and time entry and that sort of thing. That all comes with the essentials license. So consolidations, that was the other thing. Oh, and multi-currency. So those are the big nuggets that sometimes other products charge you for. They may limit or cap the number of companies you could set up. They may cap intercompany and multi-currency functionality. That's sometimes what we see. Business Central doesn't do that. So Microsoft gives you all that functionality with the Essentials license. The premium license then on top of that would give you manufacturing. So that would be multi-level bill of material with a routing. So I'd say that's, production type things. I've got a production order and I can make things. Service, I always say think HVAC type of thing. So I'd sell an
Yep.
item and
Yep.
then I'm going to perform service on it. So it'd be a service order, it could be maintenance, it could be warranty work, service dispatch. So I'm going to have a resource, I'm going to send somebody in the field, they're going to do something, I'm going to maybe invoice the customer. So that's service modules. A lot of our clients are able to get really to use the essentials license and not need to upgrade. So there's obviously a price difference between those two.
Yep.
But the essentials gives you a lot of functionality
What's
out of the
interesting
box.
and what's interesting about it, Marcus, like from like if you're a manufacturer, obviously you're looking at premium then for that, or like you said, a service shop for
Yep.
HVAC. We've got a couple other types of customers that use the service management too. But
Yep.
if you're doing like distribution, like pick, pack, put away, anything else like that, like a lot of
Yes.
those are then standard just essential licenses that you can apply towards that, right? To get to that.
Yeah, full warehouse operation. So as you said, well, I go directed picks, directed putaways.
Yep.
Even you've got
Yep.
zones and bins, and all that functionality comes with the Essentials license. So
And,
straight distribution, you can get by with the Essentials license.
And we're going to cover it in a little bit more because I'm going to open it up in a little bit, the licensing guide with it. But from a customer perspective, to really understand the business process functionality that is supported then in either the essentials or the premium. So you don't have to repeat this video and listen to Marcus say every single one, right? There's actually in the licensing guide, doesn't it actually have like the breakout then from a
Yeah,
BC perspective? Yeah, okay,
I
there. Yep.
actually just drag it
That's
over here
awesome.
for you.
Okay,
So
yeah.
yeah, they've put together a nice piece. So Business Central Essentials, more specific layout here of functionality that's part of the system. So
Okay.
again, the big ones, fixed assets is part of the Essentials. You do get the artificial intelligence. You do have customer relationship management. So CRM very light. We do have some e-commerce or e-services they're calling them. So sales tax, map, uh, project management, and the full supply chain, which is there's a lot of functionality around supply chain management, as you've said,
Yep.
warehousing, and then other capabilities that are in the system too.
Yeah, so we'll make sure you guys understand how to get to that as well because it's really, if you go to the Dynamics 365 pricing, you're going to see open licensing guide pretty constantly that's inside of there. It'll put you to sleep. If you want to read that for before bedtime, it's perfect for that type of a thing. But it gives you a lot of good details on each of the products, what's included in the license, and then also the
Yes.
reference kind of to like the Power Platform, Power Apps, like all those limited use rights that you may get as well with it. So that's something
Yep.
that we'll kind of explore here as well. So go ahead,
Yep.
Marcus. Though it's good to know on where they can get that.
Okay, so we really start with that essentials versus premium question, and one key thing to understand here is you can't mix those. So you're either an organization that has essential licensing or you have premium licensing. So it's a little bit different in the sense that I can't assign, some people an essentials license and some people the premium. Your system is either one or the other. So it's not a mix and match option there. So then we have a type of user. So the first thing we've got is a full user. So a full user is read, write access to really everything in the system. Obviously, security sits on top of that. So being a full user doesn't automatically give me access to all of that. Security sits on top of it, but I then have full read, write access. um, these are users that actually are going to process transactions in the system, and I think that's really the way to think about that user. I need to post transactions. Now whatever those transactions might be, that's really the functionality I need as a user. I'm going to go to the far right. So we're going to go from sort of this full user to what we call a team user. And a team user, I think it's best to think about that user as a read-only user. Now, there's more functionality than just read-only, but let's start at a read-only level. So if the full user is read-write, a team member really at its essence, at its core, is a read-only user. Now, you do have the ability to update existing records. So this is really a nuanced piece with the team, with a team member. So for example, I could update a customer, but I can't create a customer. I can update a vendor, I can't create a vendor. So in terms of team members that might be able to edit records or something like that, then a team member could do that. The other key thing here is I have the ability to process approvals. So I don't need to be a full user if I'm a person that's just reviewing and approving transactions. I can do that with a team member license. There's some caveats to that. The team member can't post transactions. So if, for example, in a workflow process, you actually want to initiate a post routine in that, there's going to be some limitations around, let's say, everything an approval workflow could do. It's not exactly that. But I could say, yes, I want to go in and I want to approve this purchase order, and I can go do that. So again, I hate to sort of split hairs on this sort of thing, but the license will prohibit the posting of a transaction. You can create and you can actually create sales quotes and sales orders. So the full read only and update only doesn't apply to those quote documents. So if you've got a salesperson, for example, that's putting sales quotes in, they can use a team member license. Yep.
Okay.
Um,
And that makes sense. It allows at least for, like you said, some limited use with it. But then
right.
what about if you like make extensions or anything else like that? Do you have the ability with a team member license, for example, to use some, custom code or anything else like that by chance?
Yes, you do. The limit is that there's 15 objects that you could update.
Okay,
So
okay.
there's a number limit in terms of what you can do. Again, I think the intention of what Microsoft wants to do with that team member user is to capture um, maybe those large number of users. So if you notice the bottom there is timesheets, for example. So if you've got users that are approval only type users, if you've got users that need to put timesheets in, or if you have just read only users, I think that works for a team member license. That that's probably the primary intent that Microsoft has for that team
Okay,
member.
and that makes sense. That makes
Yep.
sense. Hey,
Yep.
Justin, I wanted to say welcome as well. And then I Love Business Central posted a link to the licensing guide. So if you want to take a look at that, go ahead and download it while we're on stream here. And like I said, if you have any questions as we're going through here, make sure to pop them in chat, and then Marcus and I will make sure to hopefully address them during this conversation. Go ahead,
Yep.
Marcus. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, that's okay. So we also have this middle ground, which is called the device license. And the intent with the device license, and I would encourage you to specifically read the language in the licensing
Yep.
guide that talks about a device license. So this isn't sort of your be all end all license to avoid buying full users. Again, there's a specific intent around the device license. And this would be a license that's essentially and I hate to say it, but it's not assigned to the device necessarily itself, although it sort of is. It would be the user that you're logging into the device as, essentially. So it's intended to pick up some of those operations that are listed here. So if you think about manufacturing and shop floor, receiving, put away, picking, that sort of thing, where really you'd have maybe a handheld, you'd have a scanner or something like that in the
Yep.
field. You can assign then or use a device license for that user. So obviously there's price implications here. A full user is going to be your most expensive, your team user is your least expensive, and the device license essentially is somewhere in between those two pricing points. The key with the device license is there is some limitations. So I can't do anything in the system with a device license. It's really around some specific functionality. So I couldn't assign a device license to my sales order entry users, for example, right? It's not going to allow them to do that sort of functionality. So it's limited in terms of functionality to focus again around those places where I'd probably have a scanner primarily to do those types of things.
Yeah.
Okay?
The point is that Microsoft is trying. An example is, and I just want to interject it right here, Marcus, because you're right. You've got to think about what is the intent of the licensing, right?
That's
Because
right.
that's where when you start getting into the gray areas, that should help guide you. An example of that would be, for example, are you trying to buy device licenses to make it cheaper for you to do that task, for example? And that's, a lot of people are like, well, that's not a big issue. It's like, well, it can be, meaning that if you're trying to get around the licensing, if it says, for example, in the licensing guide, typically you need a full user for that type of license, but you find out you can do it with the team member license from a technical perspective, but the device license doesn't say explicitly that it's intended for that, well, you're out of compliance then potentially.
Yep.
So, and that's really where we come in to help direct you with that, because candidly, like, I would prefer you to have the cheaper license with it, but the worst thing that can happen is an audit, right? That where Microsoft can call up and say, we need to do an audit of your licensing, and those are never fun experiences to go through, especially if you don't have it in place in terms of that correct licensing. It's a rare event. I don't know, Marcus. It's been a long time since I've been involved in a Microsoft audit, but it does happen as you go through this process.
Yeah, I think the more likely scenario, and I actually had this happen with one of my clients where they were using a lower level license and it didn't explicitly say you could or couldn't do something. So they were doing things that the team member wasn't in. It was a team member license,
Yep.
wasn't really intended to do. Well, Microsoft actually closed the loop on that. So all of a sudden, one day users couldn't do what they thought they could do anymore. Well, if you start reading the licensing guide, they shouldn't have been able to do that in the first place. So Microsoft closed the loop. Now they're sort of stuck, and they did have to change licenses. Well, they weren't supposed to be using the team member license for that anyway. So
Yep, exactly.
I think that also could happen to you. So, okay, so that's sort of your buckets there. I just wanted to bring up a couple things with the licensing guide. Microsoft does allow you currently 3 external accountant licenses as well. So
Okay.
what that gives you is your ability, and again, think SMB, so small medium sized business. Oftentimes, you're going to have an outside accountant. With the smaller companies, had it several times when I've got maybe that 3, 4, 5 user type environment. You've got an external accountant. You've got 3 licenses that you can assign to that external accountant so that they can gain access to your system. Okay, so again, the intent there is I don't have an internal accountant that does my month-end close. I'm using an outside accountant to do that. They have access to the system and can actually process transactions for you. They're limited in terms of some admin, and they can't do any setup features. So although they could have other access in terms of posting transactions, you can't use an external accountant, let's say, to do maintenance on the system. It's not going to allow you to do that. But Microsoft is allowing you to do that, which I think is a great feature.
Yep.
It used to be 1. So there's another case where the licensing has actually changed. It's now 3 licenses that they have the ability to do. The other thing that's not on here is what they call an attached license. So if you've got a Business Central Essentials or a premium license and you've got a full user, you've got the ability to attach additional functionality, essentially is what it is. So this would be the ability to add on, they call it a customer service professional license. So if we look at CRM, there's professional and enterprise. So this would be the lower level license, if you will, the professional license, or the sales professional license. So reduced price, and again, I've taken the pricing out of here because that's just another level of complexity.
Exactly. Yeah, you can get that by going to the pricing on D365. They've changed that a couple of times now as we've gone through this. So yeah, I agree. The structure is basically the same, but the pricing changes obviously.
Right. So you can get, again, this customer service professional or sales professional license essentially as an add-on to your Business Central license to get you some CE functionality. So it's not the enterprise license, just to be straight about that. But I think for a lot of SMB users, what you get with the professional versions of both of those products could really work well for you. So nice reduced price to get you that additional functionality. The last thing, Scott, I was going to just at least touch on is some capacity changes that Microsoft made actually across the board with all their products. So when Business Central was originally released, there really weren't any data caps, if you will. So Microsoft has instituted data caps. So in terms of database storage as well as document storage, there's some nuanced differences between those. So if you're in Business Central, the idea of attaching a document to a transaction and embedding that inside of the database, there's price implications with that in terms of data size versus, let's say, storing it in a SharePoint storage location or Dataverse storage location, right? There's different ways to do that. So people just need to be aware of that. I don't know how many of our clients have actually reached that data limit. It's very few that have gotten to that point, but it's there. And there's also the number of environments that you can set up. So you can have a production environment and 3 sandbox environments with either the Essentials or the premium license. And then you could add those on too. So if you wanted more than 4 environments, you could do that. New production or sandbox. I don't know that you'd need more than 3 sandbox environments, but we've had some discussions of multiple production environments where you want specific localizations, let's say for a production environment. You're working in on a multinational organization. You need maybe Indian specific localizations in one environment, and you need US localizations in another environment. That's a way that you could accomplish that. And not having multiple tenants then. So again, there's a lot of discussion that would be what's the implications of multiple tenants versus multiple environments.
Exactly.
But it's an option for you if you needed to.
Yeah, and to your point, I mean, it is nice. I mean, the way that Business Central is designed is that each country has a localized version, and what we mean by that is all the regulatory requirements in France, for example. You've got to apply general ledger entries, right, to be able to provide that reporting perspective to the governing authorities in France. Well,
Right.
that's not a feature that we have in the US or North American version of the product. So if you
Right.
need to have multiple countries involved with it, well, you may need to have a different environment, right, to have those localizations. So
Yep, that's right.
kind of to your point, Marcus, I mean, it's nice to have that capability. But I guess really at a high level, though, it sounds like, Marcus, you've got basically a user license that's named users is the
Oh yeah,
most
we didn't even
typical
say that.
scenario, right? It's always
Yeah,
named users, right?
that's right.
Yep.
Yes.
And that's a little bit different than it was in the past because a lot of the Microsoft products, they did it off of concurrent licensing, right? Or some of the products they did off of concurrent. I think
That's true.
GP, they had a combination of it, right? So,
That's right.
they move now more to everything is named, except really for those device licenses. Technically, it's supposed to be the MAC address, if I remember correctly, or something like that,
That's
that
right. Yeah.
drives that.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's tied to the device that you're using, not to the user.
Okay.
Which there are implications about that too in terms of, let's say, user IDs that are recorded for transaction entry. But that's just a different conversation on that one.
Yeah, and Dave mentioned in chat as well, taking and stacking the attach license. I mean, it's not as prominent on the BC side, but I guess for the audience, the big thing that I want to kind of convey is that expect it to get bigger, and we're going to cover that more on the enterprise side. But Marcus, an example is, you mentioned customer relationship management is part of the license, right, inside of Business Central. Well, remember, Business Central was a separate product from Dynamics CRM back in the day. So it's not actually the CRM or the Dynamics 365 sales. That's where you get that attach license, right? And we typically
That's
now,
correct.
right? So when you're going to an opportunity and you're having a conversation with somebody, if they bring up CRM, we don't usually say use BC's built-in CRM because that really was there to support BC, right? Back in the day when we were
Yeah.
competing against CRM. Well, now we would say get the attach license to get the CRM capabilities as an example with that, right? Is that kind of where we're at now with that?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's really important that just to understand Business Central would call that functionality relationship management, which I think is probably a better term. Um, think contacts management type stuff. It's not really a full blown CRM system, and I
Exactly.
think, just to be forthright with it, I don't see Microsoft investing in doing future development with relationship management. They might. I just really doubt that we're going to see new features there. They'll keep it in the product, but I don't see development happening there. I think what we're seeing is a tighter connection with Dynamics 365 for sales, where that's the choice you'd make if you want a CRM system.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we're candidly on the enterprise side. I mean, we're already getting into discussions about one unified API that goes across both Dataverse and FinOps apps environments. Like we're getting to that point now with our conversations, even with Microsoft and what they're looking at for the future here. So, like I said, I guess the big thing is just to expect that this app services market, like from a Business Central perspective, right now they do the customer service like you had mentioned, Marcus. That's a license that you can attach to it. But field service, like that's a
Yep.
D365 field service product. Like we've got native integration into Dataverse with it. They're going to start adding attached licenses potentially for all these other services that are out there as well longer term.
Yep.
So
Professional services as well. I would look for
exactly.
that as, yep. Yep.
Yeah,
And if you look
projects.
at the I would say, cutting edge features around scheduling, around dispatch, around, I think some incredible visualizations that you can do in those products. We've looked at them, over the last year with Confab. That's where Microsoft is investing with those, I think, really cutting edge tools. Is in that platform, not necessarily in the service management
Yeah, think about another concept too. I mean, once you get Dataverse involved with this, I mean, you do have licensing that needs to be considered from that perspective as well. But Canvas apps are so much easier to develop than a Business Central app as an extension. Like
Yep.
it's just so much more convenient from an IT perspective and end user perspective to create those changes inside of a different platform, but still know that the licensing applies towards it, right?
Yep.
That's the big thing that we want to make sure you guys understand as we go through this. So, okay.
Yep. I think the only other caveat here is just edging to the Power Platform as we're here. Power BI is an additional license. So yes, you can put a Power BI report inside of Business Central, but you'd need a license for that. Oftentimes, what we're seeing is people already have that license associated with their Office account. So check there first. You may not have to purchase something. It could be there. And then Power Automate, as long as you're using Business Central as one of those connection points, you've got a Power Automate license. So you don't have to buy something extra to use that. Again, as long as it's connected to Business Central.
And that's like the limited use rights. And so I'll show that too, where you can get to that detail because, like I said, it does change. It used to be
Yep.
Power BI was included for a period of time, and then they changed that licensing as well. So,
Yep.
just part of the nature of licensing as we go through this. Well, Marcus, this has been really, really helpful. So, from a BC perspective, it really is much easier in terms of that licensing concept that's with it. I guess like we'll just jump
Well,
into
we
the
should.
enterprise side, right? Is that and
Yeah,
make it
yeah.
even
As
more
you're
confusing?
transitioning, yeah. Well, the only other thing I was going to say is if anybody's on the stream and you're an existing on-prem nav user,
Yeah,
um, you know
upgrades,
the
right?
yeah, the whole upgrade process, the transition from on-prem to SaaS, it's really best if we sit down one-on-one and talk through that. So there's a lot of implications if you've got concurrent licensing, as Scott pointed out. What is concurrent to named users? What does that transition look like? What was the predecessor to team limited users, right? Wasn't
Yep,
that what we had?
yep. It
So
was limited
the
user.
transition, yeah, that transition to from limited user to team user, what is that? What does that really mean? So we just need to have one-on-one conversations to talk through those transitions.
I guess the big thing I would say with that, make sure to stay current on maintenance. That is the
Yes.
biggest thing right there. You get such a good deal from the transition perspective if you're on maintenance. So if you're
Yes.
contemplating coming off of maintenance because you want to buy the cloud solution, know that Microsoft has incentives for you to move basically to the new licensing model. We used to call it perpetual, if I remember correctly, inside of
Yes.
Business Central. Like that's a big thing because you get a pretty steep discount, and like they like if I remember like 2 for 1, 3 for 1. They even had a promotion for 4 for 1,
Yeah.
right? Like for named
Yes.
users to concurrent user counts. So it's a pretty substantial thing.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you, Scott. And significant is not overstating this. This isn't a 10% discount kind of thing. There's significant price differences if you're on maintenance versus not on maintenance. So I agree.
Yeah, Dave's haggling us. We took too much time on your stuff supposedly, so we're gonna have to dig into the F&O, right? So
All
it's
right.
33 minutes. You got 3 extra minutes there. So, well, let's go ahead and I'm gonna get my screen kind of set up for this, Marcus, just really quickly here. So, on the enterprise side, it really is similar. I mean, candidly, I mean, we're still dealing with what we would classify as really base attached named user licensings as we go through that, right? So it's not drastically different from that perspective. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, Marcus, for you so you can see what we're doing here as we go through this. Start my sharing. All right, you see you, minimize you. And let me go ahead and open up my PowerPoint slide and everyone on stream now. The magic of 2 monitors. Marcus, I really miss being at my place and having my 5 monitors. Everyone that knows me knows that I'm nerding out right now, but gosh, I will tell you, it's been tough. We moved to the new location, absolutely love it, but the internet is not as amazing. So still trying to deal with that. So, all right, pitter patter, right? So, first thing I want to do on the enterprise side here is really I want to kind of convey what is it that you need from a system perspective. Like if we back up and think about Dynamics 365, really the struggle we have with licensing is that everything is so interconnected now. Like on the
Yep.
enterprise side, like when we now spin up, for example, project operations, which is Dynamics 365 project operations, there are multiple components involved and multiple applications involved that create that business solution for you. And on the enterprise side, we're seeing more and more traction around this, and it just creates a lot of complexity with the licensing perspective with it. So what I want to do just to really start this conversation is to understand really what are the different applications and where is the data stored. So we're not going to go into a lot of detail with it, but you need to know, how, why is it that there's a base and attach, and why is dual write being mentioned inside of the guide, and blah, 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 right? Like, what does that mean as I go through this conversation? So a couple things that I like to do, step away from the product naming and let's start with the data. Within Dynamics 365, really there are two primary data stores that we use. And this really applies towards BC too. We've got the
It
Business
does.
Central environment, right? That's more of the
Yes.
ERP-ish type stuff. And then we've got the CRM stuff, right? That is the more Dynamics 365 customer engagement capabilities that you can attach to it. And really, as part of that discussion, it's critical to understand that because that's what drives then your licensing. And we're kind of cutting off that last portion of the slide, but understanding those is critical to the successful implementation is really what I'm mentioning inside of there. So the database technologies that we use are two different ones, right? We've got Dataverse that has a lot of what we call our model-driven apps and some of those capabilities, formerly known as Common Data Service, right? And then we've got our finance and operations apps, right? So if you're going to be implementing a business process on the enterprise side, you're probably dealing with these two environments just right off of the gate, no matter what, every single time. So you need to start thinking about licensing from both of these perspectives when you're going through really your deployment lifecycle. And part of the discussion that we have with people is to really understand then, what are the differences between them, right? Because on Dataverse, for example, we've got model-driven applications and canvas-driven applications and portal-driven applications, and all of those have a licensing perspective with it. And then on the FinOps side, we also have X++ applications that we create that then drive really some of that native functionality, right? Some of that I would say ERP-ish type functionality inside of an environment. So two licensing aspects that need to be covered with it. And as part of that, really, when we start thinking about Dataverse and model-driven applications and then X++ applications, we can kind of go back over to the product naming now, because now we know there are two different types of technologies that applications are built in within the two environments that we have. And from there, we can start mapping those applications, right? Because what Microsoft has done is they've built a platform, which is Dataverse or FinOps apps, and then they've built applications on top of that, and then they license those applications. But they also give you the ability to then basically license your applications so that you don't have to use their pre-built applications if you want to, right? It's a development platform. And I think that's a big thing that people miss when they look at this. They look at it and say, well, it's just an application. No, it's really a platform that you're interacting with. So when we start talking through that, we have our Dataverse, we have our finance and operations apps. On Dataverse, we've got like remote assist, field service, customer service, marketing, and then sales. Those are all applications that you can buy. You can buy a full user named license for any of those types of applications on the Dynamics 365 side. And you'll see this in the pricing guide as you go through it. And then on the other side of the house, when you start talking about like finance or supply chain or commerce or HR, technically project operations is in here as well. Those are then what we call our finance and operations database environments, right, that we can interact with. So those then have different licensing that can be applied towards it. And what Microsoft is really doing here from a licensing and also from a product strategy perspective is that you can buy any of these applications, and you can, for example, implement just Dynamics 365 supply chain with no finance capabilities to do just inventory management and advanced warehouse as an example, and then you can attach, for example, then customer relationship management or Dynamics 365 sales, as we would call it, to that license so that you can then interact then with a CRM-ish type perspective within your environment. So that's really what Microsoft is doing here, is that they're building applications that you can then license, and then they're also then exposing at various levels the ability for you, for example, to license, for example, a Power App that looks inside of Dynamics 365. Like you can pay $10 a month to just license a Power App that's for a named user, that's for a limited use that you may be interacting with as part of that. And
Well, and you don't even have to have one of those Dynamics 365 apps to do that, right?
correct,
So you
right?
could buy, you could buy a license that allows you to do essentially your own app development in the Dataverse.
Yep, correct, right?
Yeah.
And that's the cool thing about it, is that the base attached then allows you to get into a situation where you're not, I mean, imagine if you had to pay, the pricing on the enterprise side, it's like $180 per named user, right? I mean, that gets pretty cost prohibitive pretty quickly. Whereas what Microsoft is saying is that once you buy into the Dynamics 365 stack, if you want to add additional product functionality or use case scenarios, you can do that, and we're not going to charge you for the full license for it. Like you get the ability to do attachments then to it. And I'll show a little bit of what those are here too. And it's important to note that there's other, and we're going to talk about it too. We're not just talking about the app pricing. We're also talking about then, for example, like the add-on. There's add-ons that you can do as well.
Yep.
So,
Well, and I think it's important to think about that Dataverse add-on. And I think we're seeing more and more people understanding that they could do that development inside of Dataverse, probably at a much lower cost than doing it inside of finance and operations or inside of Business Central.
yeah.
It's a great option for people.
I mean, yeah, I 100% agree. Like, I couldn't agree more with that, Marcus. Like, there's definitely a place for Business Central extensions and also
Yes.
finance and operations apps extensions, right? I mean,
Yes.
they absolutely are needed. But when it comes to a lot of the solutions that are being put out there nowadays, like typically, like even our team showcased in our sales and marketing meetings that we have internally, our delivery team is showcasing to us applications that they build that are using Dataverse, even though that customer has a finance and operations license. Like there's just so much more or easier to manage, or it's more mobile friendly. Like there's just advantages then to use that Dataverse perspective as part of this. So
Yep.
I
Yep.
100%
And from
agree.
a licensing perspective, it's less expensive.
Exactly. So moving on here, really what I want to kind of highlight then, the differences obviously are in it. I mean, this is more just saying, at a high level, remember that the reason that there are two separate platforms are that if you look at the market and what's happened with it, I don't want to get into a big discussion about this on stream here, but really what happened is that you had two separate products that went to the cloud, right? Dynamics CRM was much more of a cloud-centric concept than the Dynamics AX or NAV or GP products, or even Solomon for that matter, right? Those were always on-prem solutions, where CRM was more front and center on the cloud. And a lot of those concepts, what they did is they basically just created two development platforms then that we can use to be able to tackle a lot of those business processes. I guess at the most fundamental level, like if I can talk from an IT perspective, it's like the jet engine in Exchange versus SQL Server. Like there's just two different technologies. The Exchange server has a database technology that it ran off of for emails and all that kind of stuff. And they never made it work off of SQL Server because it just didn't work as well for those use cases. And they've found that CRM-ish type integrations or interactions with an end user are quite fundamentally different sometimes than that of an ERP-ish or operational user. So you need two different types of looks and feels potentially to tackle some of those requirements. So that's why we've never gotten to the Project Green, as they called it in the past, right? Where they've actually have one solution or one system to rule them all. I think realistically, the end user experience is really front and center, and I think that's why they're moving more towards this as part of it, but making the
Yep.
tools more unified on the technology perspective, right, Marcus?
Yep. Yep. Absolutely agree with that. Absolutely agree with that. Yeah. Just watching users, you can see that. If you watch somebody in a CRM system versus an ERP system, you're just thinking through your transaction differently.
Exactly. So other thing to note now too, like when we start talking about other applications, so I just gave you the base applications that are usually driven towards one of those two environments from a licensing perspective, but there are now microservices or micro apps, as I would call them, that are coming to market as well. And what those are capabilities that are then added into, for example, Dynamics 365 sales or Dynamics 365 supply chain that then have native connectors that go into those applications to then give you an additional service that you then license to pay for. An example, Dynamics 365 fraud protection is actually natively supported in D365 Commerce, but it also has a model-driven app for portal interaction that you can use with it. It's considered a proprietary microservice that's on the Microsoft platform that you can then pay for an additional fee. You don't have to have for, excuse me, you have to have, for example, D365 Commerce, but if you want to add on that fraud protection, you can do that. You don't need to use it out of the box. Project operations, huge. Like this is the example of what I've talked to our team internally about of where Microsoft is going. Project Operations has multiple applications. It has a model-driven app, and it also has a FinOps app to handle, for example, the invoicing and billing and expense management portions of it. But they're joined together as one product offering. So when you buy Project Operations, you have the ability to deploy only the model-driven app or to do a mixed scenario where you're doing both the FinOps apps environment and then also the model-driven apps. And I know it's kind of confusing from a terminology perspective, but the thing to note here is that we're crossing two environments with one license type that's now managing that. So you pay for a project operations license to have access then to both of these types of environments. Guides is another one. Customer voice is a big one that we've demoed as well, where you're adding then on top of customer service, for example, additional capabilities for the customer voice for the services to be able to actually go through and then have that data come back and then interact with it from surveys and things of that nature that you can drive. And then even the intelligent order management, Marcus, that just came out, right?
Yep.
That's the new one that they just announced, where it's got a connector for D365 Commerce, but it allows for you to basically use a model-driven app to do order management. Like it's a new concept that's being introduced that's at a level above that of just buying D365 Commerce, right? So they continue to then add a lot of these applications as time goes on here. And really, what I want to mention here just is like what happens when apps spam processes, right? And I'm going to just breeze through this really quickly. But an example is that when we start talking about licensing, there's a concept that we use on the enterprise side more commonly called dual write, where we're basically enabling then in an environment specific tables that are copied back and forth between Dataverse and between FinOps apps, right? Between the finance and supply chain capabilities. Now, remember, if you just buy D365 Finance, for example, you don't have to use dual write to integrate into Dataverse. You can if you want to, but you've got to know that there's additional licensing to consider with that. And in the licensing guide, they'll even state, for example, that you get a Dataverse environment when you buy a FinOps app environment, right? So when you buy a user license, or technically there's 20 user licenses that you need to buy on the FinOps app side at a minimum. But once you do that, then you can connect, for example, a Dataverse environment, and it's treated from a licensing perspective as one environment, one platform, so to speak. Kind of like what Dave mentioned earlier in the chat here as well. So, it's a really big differentiator here that we have with it. And this is why, and I documented this just to show, when you go through, for example, a lead process, For example, you're going to generate a lead inside of Dynamics 365 Sales. Well, that lead data is stored in Dataverse, right? So this is an example then of a D365 for Sales license that I need to be able to go through this lead process. Now, when I take that lead and I actually go through and qualify it, I convert it into an opportunity, right? So we're just going down that lead, qualify, opportunity, right? That whole basic business process that we all pretty much know. But the point here then is that that opportunity is now inside of D365 for Sales. But eventually, as that lead gets converted inside of here, so as we, for example, generate a quote against an opportunity, what you can see here with the dual write integration is that we have, for example, quotes that are both in D365 for Sales for the quote, but then from an operational perspective, when I look at finance and operations, I can see that quote then inside of that environment, inside of the FinOps apps environment to interact with it. So if I have, for example, D365 supply chain, I could see all the quotes that people are making to be able to then access that. Where I could just create quotes and just have a D365 for Sales license, but then if I don't have that attached, I wouldn't then have that data copy back and forth, right? If you don't have that license. And the point here is that you can mix and match these, and that's where it's going moving forward here as we start looking at what that vision is from Microsoft's perspective. But then as well, when you change it to an order, obviously supply chain, right? Hey, CRM isn't going to be where you're doing fulfillment of orders typically. You're doing fulfillment of orders from a distribution perspective. Well, when it's one, it converts that then into an order as part of that process, right? And then we generate, for example, our picking list, and we may update statuses that then say, for example, on that order that it's picked. And then finally, ultimately it's shipped, and we also may update some of those statuses as well as part of that process. So that's something just to know here is that when we're looking at processes now, on the enterprise side, we're spanning multiple products to be able to do that, right? And then cash applied, for example, was another one where it shows as paid then inside of the Sales Hub for this. And what's cool about this, Marcus, this is a native solution. This is native setup that we have that allows for all this prospect basically to delivery lifecycle or prospect to cash lifecycle that we can get all this detail inside of here pretty quickly and easily. So here's an example. I'll actually publish this slide deck for us to be able to access in the future. But really, what's that mean then for licensing? And really what it means is that you've got 3 different levels of licensing that you need to consider when looking at the enterprise solution. You've got your base named user, you've got your attach named user, and then you have add-ons. And add-ons might be database capacity, they could be order lines, number of transactions that you're doing, right? There's some of that pricing then that's based off of that. And the first thing that you want to consider from the enterprise perspective is really what's the difference between the base and the add-on. So I'm a named user, for example. We'll pick on me, Scott Frappier, that does invoicing and also shipping for some reason. We run into multiple scenarios every day. Well, to do that, I need both a Dynamics 365 supply chain, because that's shipping, packing is actually part of that license. And then when I'm doing invoicing, that's part of the D365 finance license. So I'm going to need, for example, $180 base license of D365 supply chain, and I'm going to need an attached license of D365 finance to be able to do the invoicing activities. And so as part of your exploration, when you're trying to figure out what end users do, when you align them to the roles, there's actually a role spreadsheet that we have on the enterprise side that you can get from our team. That helps you then align really what that product functionality is and what you can do in the system to be able to do that product functionality basically. So that's just something to know. Yep.
And just to point out that is very different from the way that Business Central does their licensing.
It is.
They're very distinct. You still have that concept of an attached license, but it's not a Business Central license that should be attaching. It would be that Dynamics 365 sales or customer service license that should be attached.
Yep.
Different concept there.
And this is the thing, like you look at it, so, and here's where it just gets really kind of, obvious, right? So,
Yeah, this
like
is
you were
actually a really
saying,
good slide.
right? Yeah, exactly. Because this is the
Yep.
base attach perspective. So remember, look at it from a named user perspective and what that user is doing. For example, if I've got supply chain management, I can attach a commerce license to it, or I can attach a customer service enterprise, or a finance license, or a project operations license to it, or a sales enterprise or pro, right? So I can then attach these different levels of services. Whereas let's
Yep.
say I only have Dynamics 365 Sales Premium. Well, then I can only add, for example, customer service or field service as an attached license, or HR or project operations. The intent of this, and this is in the licensing guide, it helps
Yep.
you establish where do you have to buy your base licenses, and where can you, if you have an existing product, then just have the attached licenses, which are, like we said, they're substantially cheaper. They're like 20 or 30 bucks, Marcus, last I
Yep.
recall, off of them.
Yep.
So
Well,
really,
less even for the Business Central side.
yeah, exactly. So,
Yep.
and you can see from a Business Central perspective, you get the customer service that you could do, but you could also do then the Dynamics 365 for sales. That's the Sales Pro. It's not the enterprise version of it, which means there are some limitations between Pro and enterprise. But the point is then is if you came to me and you said, I want to do CRM activities inside of Business Central, I would say, you know what, for 20 bucks or 30 bucks or whatever it is, you should add
Yep.
the Sales Pro license to that named user, and they're going to get a best of breed solution that competes with Salesforce, that is designed for customer relationship management from that role perspective. It's so much of a better fit. Like it's just
Yep. Absolutely.
there's more apps available for it. Like you can add into that environment as well. I don't know, Marcus. I just don't see people. There's very limited use cases on the CRM side or the relationship management in BC that I see compared to using Sales Pro, I guess, at this point.
Yeah, I agree 100%. The feature functionality actually isn't. It's not comparable between the two
Yep.
systems.
Yep.
Yep.
So, and there's rare use cases. I don't want you to be scared if you're using a relationship management. If you're using it, it does a lot of the same base capabilities that Sales Pro does. But I mean, if you want to have a mobile phone app, if you want to, do a lot of those types of capabilities, those are native inside of Sales Pro, as an example, inside of here. So,
Yep. Yep.
moving on as well, then really quickly. So user licensing, we kind of covered this as well on the enterprise side. We have the same concept in a lot of ways between that and BC. We've got our named users where we've got a team license, an HR license, an operations or activity license, and then full user licenses that we either have base or attached rights that we add to it, right? So those are things to consider that we're always pretty much in a named user perspective inside of licensing. So, if that's the first question you have, just know every user that accesses the system needs to have a license level really attached to them. The exception to that, just like in BC, are the device licenses. So you can have device licenses that are specific towards documented roles, and it states it inside of the licensing guide what those roles are, such as doing picks or warehouse operations, or using the shop floor control or production execution capabilities of D365 supply chain. Like those are device licenses that you can apply towards that. So handheld
Very similar to
scanners.
Business Center. Business.
Exactly.
Yeah. Very similar.
Yep. So just something to note here is that it allows you then to basically then at least have some shared use. But you can't, for example, if you've got 5 people that are running accounting activities and they're the same ones, and you just want to make it so that they're revolving the computer that they're interacting with, that's not. You can't apply a device license across a perceived role that you have that may share those responsibilities. It
Yep.
has to be documented in the licensing guide as a supported path or use case for the device licenses in the environment. Otherwise, it defaults obviously to the named user perspective inside of here. So kind of boring, but it's something to note. And then the other big one, we get this so commonly now. This is a big one that you need to know about and you need to be ready for. And the reason I mention this is because we've gotten a lot of customers that have gone through the quotation process and they've found out that, for example, they have a 2 terabyte on-prem database that they wanted to bring up to the cloud and upgrade their Dynamics 365 AX 2012 R3 to finance and operations apps. Well, they find out that they only have, for example, 120 gigabytes of storage capacity. How are they going to convert that, right? So storage is a premium in the cloud environment. I mean, we're talking about, just candidly, I mean, Marcus, I think this is the same on BC. It's like $40 per gigabyte, right? Per month that you have to apply towards it. So if you want to add 10 gigabytes to your environment, you're looking at $400 a month in terms of cost. That goes above and beyond really what you have as part of the default subscription license, right? And there are a couple of factors that are involved with this. This is not something I can just put one slide up and have every scenario. Every user license gives you what's called an entitlement in terms of additional capacity that's applied towards the environment. So if you have 500 users, for example, you get more capacity storage, for example, compared to a 20 user site, right? So there are factors that play into this, but capacity is a very important thing to consider, especially when you're looking at upgrading from an on-prem solution, because there are different ways now that we tackle, for example, reporting. We don't put everything in the database, we put it into a data lake because it's pennies per gigabyte as opposed to multiple dollars per gigabyte, right? So really big thing to consider when you're going through this process really is those capacity add-ons. And then really finally here, note that from a Power Platform perspective on the enterprise side, you get some really cool capabilities that are in here. You get, for example, limited use rights with Power Apps and with Power Automate that are documented. And what I would recommend with that, I actually have it open here. On our licensing guide, you can see I've got, here's basically the licensing guide that I love BC posted inside of the chat so you can get to that detail. But there's also a Power Apps and Power Automate one that's inside of here. And the reason I just bring this up is because inside of the Power Apps and Power Automate, you'll see that there's actually an appendix inside of here. And this goes through and then defines, for example, if you have project operations, that you have limited use rights with a qualifying license, for example, with field service or project ops or with team member licensing or finance or supply chain management, right? So they define then what those limited use rights are. So then, for example, instead of designing an app inside of D365 Finance, an X++ app, you could actually create a Power App, but you still have the ability then to have that end user interact with that Power App. And this is becoming more common because we have, for example, inside of the finance and operations apps, which is finance supply chain, you can actually add Power Apps directly into the user interface. So an example is one of the prospects that we interacted with that became our customer. They wanted to have mapping capabilities on an order so that they could see where the delivery was going to occur. And we don't have that as a base capability in supply chain. And I've even shown this on Confab in the past. So what happened then is they added a Power App, and that Power App then would then show that mapping detail that's related to it. So those are the big areas I'd really recommend for you to take a look at as you go through really your licensing discussion. And one other thing just to note inside of here, like if you have questions regarding, like, for example, what does finance have inside of here, you can see inside of here that this defines then each of those licensing levels that you can then interact with. So if you're looking at purchasing, for example, D365 Finance, if you go to the finance section here, it's going to tell you what roles, for example, can you get away with a team member? What roles are activity licenses so that you can actually not have a full license, but you can still then pay for a lesser license then to interact with it, an operations activity license. And then which ones require the full finance license, for example. Each of the sections in the licensing guide really defines that in a lot more detail. So that way you can make an educated decision then, or come to the table at least a little bit more educated when you're talking with your partner to really then align what are the license levels that you're really going to need to be successful for the deployment of your product, to be quite honest. So
yeah. And actually, if you go back to that that table of contents, you've got all the product names in there. I know there's a lot of confusion with people around Dynamics 365. So right here you can see there are a lot of applications with the Dynamics 365 name. So you do need to get specific about that. It's not just Dynamics 365.
Yep. Yep. So yeah, I mean, I wish we had more time. I mean, we've taken up quite a bit of time here just going through kind of the base concepts with you from a licensing perspective. I mean, obviously, if you have more questions, feel free to reach out to us. We would be more than happy to answer those. Or if you have them on stream here too, we're going to be here for a couple more minutes. But just kind of do some of the housekeeping at the end here. To really understand what is next, right? So that's going to be here in terms of our our content, right, Marcus? So we've gone through the licensing today to get to some more details with that. Really, our next conversation that we're having on September 9th, to my recollection, is that data strategy and reporting, right? So how should you actually be doing reporting, right? Because it's a pretty common question that we've been receiving in terms of that structure and in terms of like, how do I use Synapse? Like, Stone Ridge does a data assessment, for example, that I know Greg Graham and the delivery team really tackles. But if you're coming into it and you say, I want to use the Microsoft technologies that drive reporting and data mining, what do I use in that conversation? And what do I use if I'm using BC, or if I use, for example, FinOps apps, or if I use the model-driven Dataverse apps, right? Like, how do you do that reporting perspective? So September 9th, we're going to tackle that in some more detail, which is really, I'm excited, Marcus. It's a pretty common question that we have at this point.
Yep, that'll be a fun session.
Cool. All right, kind of with that, we're a little bit over time. Thank you, everyone, for joining Confab. We look forward to the conversation on the 9th. Until then, stay safe, and we hope to see you on stream later. Thank you again.
Have a good day.
you